Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
Thanks so much for joining us today for another study in the Word. We're back in the book of Ruth and continuing our study of the concept of covenant as we see it in the Old and New Testament. The book of Ruth is fascinating because it highlights not only the covenant relationship between God and the Israelite people, but it lets us see some beautiful interpersonal covenant relationships. Last week we talked about the one between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, Naomi and Ruth. And this week we're going to look at one in the marriage context of Boaz and Ruth. But we also have here a foreshadowing of the new covenant relationship that we have with God through Jesus Christ, who was the descendant of the family that we're studying here in the book of Ruth. We love Ruth, don't we?
Yes, we do.
A bright light, one little candle flame illuminating an otherwise very dark period of Israelite history.
Yes, it's a fascinating book. It's got such interesting stories, but it also reflects so much the culture of the time, and we can get a taste for what life was like in a very early time, but a very significant time, as you were saying, for us and for all of history.
Yeah. When we use the word covenant, I often think of God's covenant relationship with the chosen people, Israel. But when you think about it from another perspective, many of the covenants that are discussed in the Old Testament are personal covenants, starting with God and Noah, and then God and Abraham, and Abraham's descendants, Isaac and Jacob, and on. And then we've just studied some interpersonal covenants between David and Jonathan and Naomi and Ruth last week. And we come to another one of those this time. Now, you said that we get a real glimpse at the ancient Israelite culture in the story of Ruth.
Yes.
And one of the facets of that culture was a feature of their law called levirate marriage. And that kind of lies behind the dynamics of what's going on in this story. So
definitely,
let's talk about that for just a minute.
There was a serious concern that a family line should go down through the generations. And if there was a premature death before there were children, then there was a responsibility of the rest of the family to make sure that there were descendants of that line of the family.
How did they pull that off?
Well, they take the next of kin, and if the next of kin is able to assume the responsibility, that male would take the widow and have children by her who would be considered the children of the deceased. If that male didn't take that responsibility, then it would go to the next of kin. Until you found someone who would take the responsibility. And they took it seriously enough that they would follow through until someone did.
Yeah. It seems like it would have caused some social or familial chaos.
Oh, yes.
And there were problems that came out of it.
Yeah.
But this is how seriously they took this family line of inheritance of land and property and name, the name of the deceased. So that was a feature of the Mosaic Law, and it definitely was practiced, sometimes not practiced and problematic, as in the story of Judah. But we know that it wasn't one of those laws that was in the law but was ignored.
No, and apparently it was a custom across the ancient Near East, and one commentator indicated that there are evidences that even in the Moabite culture this was done.
So this may not have been a big surprise to Ruth when she got back to Judah, this phenomenon of the levirate marriage. She may have grown up in a culture that had that as well. Well, good. Now, we need to catch up between last week's lesson from chapter 1 and this week's lesson from chapter 3, because some very important things have taken place since Ruth insisted on returning with Naomi to Bethlehem of Judah from her homeland in Moab. The latter part of chapter 1 tells the story of that return. And when Naomi gets back and meets some of her contemporary women who she hasn't seen for 10 years, she doesn't come back a happy camper, does she?
As a matter of fact, she tells them her husband died, both of her sons have died, and she says, "Don't call me Naomi."
Yeah, which means pleasant. Yes.
Call me Mara.
Mara, which means bitter.
Yes.
So she comes back kind of bitter at the loss of husband and children.
And there's one reference in chapter 1 that she saw all that happened as God being against her.
Yeah. So she's really struggling both socially with the loss of her family and spiritually.
Right.
And so there's kind of, the rest of the story of Ruth is kind of a rescue operation for Naomi.
It is.
And Ruth is aware of her role in that. And it turns out, as we're going to see, Boaz is as well. He's aware that what he's doing is out of kindness for Naomi.
Concerned about Naomi.
Not just himself and Ruth.
Yeah.
And jumping ahead just a little bit, when we get to the very end of chapter 4, the end of the book, we see Naomi holding her grandbaby.
Right.
And so it kind of comes full circle.
We have friends who just had a grandchild, and Facebook is full of grandmother holding a baby, and that's Naomi.
Yeah. So the bitterness that we see at the end of chapter 1 is taken away by the end of the story. As we move on into chapter 2, Naomi and Ruth have come back widows. Ruth is kind of orphaned from her biological family back in Moab, and she's an alien.
Right.
So how they're going to survive financially becomes a real issue.
And not just an alien, but kind of a despised alien. I mean,
true.
the Moabites were not, the Israelites didn't care for them.
They were real enemies.
Right.
They were real enemies. So the only way in which they can figure out to survive, fortunately, it's barley harvest time. So she decides to join the poor folks of the Bethlehem area in gleaning in the fields.
That was a provision made in the law.
Okay, what's gleaning?
The farmers were told not to harvest absolutely everything in their field, but to leave a little bit for the poor people to come along after the harvesters and glean or pick up the leftovers,
kind of the scraps,
and survive on that.
Right.
When we were in Indiana years ago, a tornado had gone through and destroyed part of the corn crop, and one particular farmer couldn't get his equipment in to pick the corn, but still there was a lot of corn that was there because the plants were down. Our youth group was hired to go in and glean and pick up the corn, and they earned some money for mission trips by gleaning. So I thought, here's the Old Testament coming back.
That's right. Well, I grew up on a farm, and my father would have been very angry if I didn't mow the hayfield right up to the very edges and back up and get the corners. But in ancient Israel, you couldn't harvest the edges or the corners. And you couldn't go back and pick up the scraps that fell. That was all for the poorer members of the community, which is really quite a lovely custom. And
it was a welfare system that enabled the people to work, but still provided for them.
Provide food for their families. Well, that's what Ruth does at the beginning of chapter 2. She goes into the fields. Turns out it's the fields of a wealthy landowner named Boaz, and there she gleans. Boaz notices the arrival of this foreigner.
Everybody knows about them.
This would have been a small agricultural community, and Ruth's arrival would have been much talked about and noticed. Boaz makes provision for this foreign widow in lovely and striking ways. The first thing he does is to offer her protection.
Right.
He says, you hang out with my reapers, and I'll give them orders to treat you well and not abuse you, and they'll also give you personal physical protection. That's his first offer. Then he offers her water. Says,
Which is a precious commodity.
Pretty important. You can drink water with my agricultural workers. But then he offers her the most beautiful thing of all, and it's a blessing. It's in chapter 2, verse 12, and I'd like to read it. This is Boaz blessing on this stranger from Moab, Ruth. He says, "May the Lord reward you for your deeds." And he must be referring to her deeds of faithfulness to Naomi.
Right. The fact that she came back and
Yeah.
she's helping protect her.
"May the Lord reward you for your deeds. May you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Here, Boaz thinks of God as a mother bird who's extending her wings over her chicks
Beautiful picture.
and to give them protection. And he says, may God be that mother hen, that mother bird to you, even though you're a widow, you're a foreigner, etc. The next thing Boaz offers Ruth is food. He offered her water, now he offers her food, bread and some wine. And then finally, at the end of the day, loads her down with a gift.
Extra provisions
Yeah.
to take back to Naomi.
Yeah, some of this grain that has been cut. So he loads her down with, the reaping has been done, the threshing hasn't been done yet, so it's probably stalks of barley with the barley grains on the head. So he loads her down with that to take back to Naomi.
Yeah.
At any rate, Boaz wants God to provide for Naomi, for Ruth and Naomi, but he sees himself as an agent of that provision, that divine provision.
Yeah.
That's a lovely part of it.
Yeah.
Well, at the end of chapter 2, Ruth goes back and reports to Naomi, and I think some light bulbs went on in Naomi's head, don't you think?
Naomi recognized the name. Oh, he's a relative of my husband. So the wheels are turning apparently. That he's in the picture as a possible redeemer. But at least he's been generous. He's been kind. He's protective. Stay with it.
Make sure you go back to his
Right.
fields. Yeah. You know that you used the word redeemer, and we probably should have mentioned that when we were talking a few minutes ago about this levirate marriage law. The near relative who took the responsibility of fathering a child for the deceased relative was called a kinsman redeemer, a near relative who redeemed or rescued the family from
Extinction,
loss,
as it were.
from extinction. Good. Well, that's what was in between. And so now we come to Ruth chapter 3, verse 1, and I'll read the text here for us. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he'll be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you're there until he's finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he's lying, then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I'll do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You've not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you're a woman of noble character. Although it's true that I'm a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I." When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man won't rest until the matter is settled today."
Okay.
Well, Naomi is as eager to find a marriage partner for Ruth now as she was when they first came back and said, we need to find rest for you. We need you to be provided for.
Yeah, it's like they've been there a while and they're surviving, but Naomi, as she had the awareness when they started back that maybe the daughters-in-law ought to stay there, now she's got the awareness as they've come back that she's getting older, and this situation can't continue as it is indefinitely, and so we've got to do something.
Yeah.
And so she pushes the issue that we've got to get something to happen.
The source of income and food that they have from gleaning only took place in a very narrow window at harvest time.
Right.
Now, they did have several harvests of several different grains, but that wouldn't sustain the two of them indefinitely. And Naomi knows that the only true social security for a woman in that culture was marriage.
Right.
And so that's the implication of verse 1 in chapter 3. We need to find a home for you, meaning a husband.
Yeah.
And that way you'll be provided for. And in fact, that's really the only source of social security for Naomi as well.
Right.
Not as well as Ruth.
Yeah.
Well, Naomi grew up in Bethlehem, is from there, so she knows how the whole agricultural cycle works. What we have is reaping, then threshing, then winnowing.
Yeah.
And so those events are referred to here. Maybe we ought to quickly clarify what was involved in that.
Yeah, the winnowing is something that comes in a couple of times in Old Testament stories, and it's significant because you're getting rid of the husks and keeping the grain in the husks are lighter, and as you winnow it and throw it up in the air, the wind will carry off the refuse and leave you with the grain.
Right.
And of course the story earlier in the Judges about Gideon, they were winnowing in a pit.
Yeah.
In an olive pit. Which
to hide from their enemy soldiers.
So the enemies wouldn't come and steal their crop.
Yeah.
Which was the terrible place. You don't have any wind.
Yeah.
But here it's a time when they're, and apparently it's the end of the season, and it sounds like as they finish things up, it's going to be a celebration time. Naomi's aware of that.
Yeah.
And they're all going to be staying there with the crop so they can guard it. This is the time to go and be there.
They're all going to, Boaz is going to be feeling good because the harvest is over. They've had their feast and their celebration.
Yeah.
This will be a positive time for you to reach out to him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the reaping represents the actual cutting of the stalks of grain. Then the threshing, or they would lay these stalks down and beat them with flails. And that would loosen the kernels of grain and kind of get them a little bit separated from the stalk and from the chaff. Then, as you say, the winnowing, they take shovels, what look like big broad wooden shovels, and throw it up, and they do it when there's a breeze, and blows the chaff away, and the heavier kernels of grain fall into a heap.
Yeah.
And then they spend the night there.
You stay with the crop. Yeah.
To protect it,
Yeah.
to guard it. So that's what Naomi is talking about in verse 2. And they did that winnowing that you described at night because evidently in that area of Judah, a breeze would come up in the early evening.
Evening breezes, yeah.
So that would be the best time to winnow. Well, she not only understands that agricultural cultural phenomenon, but she knows how to, can I say, pitch woo?
I think so.
Or whatever. That's an old expression that I guess some people will know. And that's in verse 3. She gives Ruth some very detailed instructions.
Right.
I guess they didn't bathe every day in that culture, probably.
Probably
didn't they?
not,
So
but she's to wash now.
she's going to take a bath now.
Yeah.
Pat, my wife, had a grandmother who had hair that went down to her calves or her ankles. It was the longest hair. She washed her hair once a year on the 4th of July.
Is that right?
And the whole family would help unbraid her hair, help her wash it, and then they'd braid it back, and she would wear it. So I don't know if Ruth had washed recently or not, but she did wash this. The phrase "put on perfume" is literally smear oil on you, and in that very, very dry culture in the ancient Mideast, people anointed their bodies with oil, like olive oil or something like that, as kind of a conditioner, kind of a skin conditioner, and it was usually perfumed a little bit. So this is oiling her body, not just dabbing a little bit of perfume on. And then get dressed in your best clothes. I read a suggestion that Ruth may have been wearing widow's clothing that is suggestive of mourning, a period of mourning, up until this time. And that makes some sense to you,
It does. And the whole process of what Naomi's telling her to do is to essentially make yourself available because you're really showing him that you're available to be married.
Yeah.
And it almost sounds reflective of the book of Esther, where the women were prepared for the king to evaluate, or they, it took a time of preparation and all the process of preparing themselves. So she's essentially announcing, I'm no longer mourning, I'm available.
That might explain the instructions about clothing. That also might explain, I like your suggestion there, because that also would explain the otherwise kind of forward behavior of Ruth at the threshing floor.
Yes.
Some people have scratched their heads about that. Naomi really wants Ruth to act in a kind of open, forward way.
Yeah.
So there's no question about her intentions.
Right.
She says, when you go down there, I want you to uncover his feet.
Yeah.
Which might strike people as somewhat forward, and lie down his feet.
Yeah.
And maybe put his cloak that he's lying under over you a little bit, which may seem almost suggestive.
Yeah. But a woman couldn't propose marriage, and yet here's a situation where Naomi is coaching her to do everything you can do to say, I'm available, I'm ready. And the thing of uncovering the feet has been seen, and some would see it may have been more than that, but we also find that Boaz respects what she's done, so it's not over the line,
Right.
but it's close to the line.
It seems to be, but the fact is, Boaz recognizes Ruth as a virtuous woman.
Yes.
He says as much in verse 11. You're a virtuous woman. You're a noble woman.
Yeah.
Clearly, Naomi is a virtuous and noble-minded woman.
Right.
And Boaz is clearly a noble person who doesn't take advantage of women, doesn't take advantage of Ruth. And so I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt that Ruth's behavior here is not inappropriate sexual innuendo.
No.
And I don't know that we need to go that way.
Yeah, it sounds like she crawls into the sleeping bag, but there's a limit of what she does.
She's lying very respectfully and humbly at his feet.
Right.
Well, she promises Ruth that she'll do, she promises Naomi that she'll do what Naomi instructs, and she does. And Boaz does not take offense. He wakes up. Who is this? And she speaks very humbly, I'm your bondswoman, Ruth.
Yeah.
And then I love what she says, spread the wing, it's the word wing, spread the wing of your garment over me, since you are the guardian redeemer of our family. And that harkens back to that blessing that I read from chapter 2, verse 12. Boaz says, I pray that God will give you his reward, under whose wings you have come for protection. And what Ruth is saying here is, okay, if you want God to spread his wings over me, you're going to have to spread your wing
The wing
over
of your
me.
garment.
You
yeah.
need to be God's agent of protection for me.
Yeah.
And he doesn't take offense. In verse 10, he blesses her and uses this beautiful covenant word, chesed, which the NIV translates kindness.
Yeah.
Your kindness is just greater than ever. What would we think of as the earlier kindness that he showed?
Well, the fact that she came back with Naomi to care for her, and the fact that she's come to the fields to glean, it's remarkable, and everybody in town knows about this.
Yeah.
And he says, all the people of my town, or the people at the gate, where all the talk goes on, know how good you are and how much you've done, and they respect. There's this foreign woman from an alien country that they don't like, but they have to respect what she's done, who she is.
And he respects her somewhat forward, reaching out to him, saying, will you marry me and fulfill your role as the kinsman redeemer in our family?
He calls her my daughter a couple of times, which sounds like he might have been older, but then he specifically says, I'm impressed you haven't chased after the younger men.
Right.
So...
And he may have been older, we don't know that for sure, or it may have been a phrase of affection, as it was with Naomi. Well, he does have to clarify the fact that he does not have first claim to Chilion's widow.
Right.
And so he says, I'm going to have to go to the gate of the city of Bethlehem and work this out with the closer relative.
Yeah.
And that does happen in chapter 4. But in the meantime, Ruth returns to Naomi and tells her what's going on, an even greater gift of grain from the winnowing floor. And Naomi says, okay, at this point, we're just going to have to relax and trust Boaz to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In chapter 4,
did he do the right thing?
He does, and immediately goes and sits at the gate and encounters the person he's talked about, and then says, there's some land available, do you want it? And the guy says, well, maybe, and he says, well, also there's a widow that goes along with it, and he says, on the other hand, maybe I don't.
Yeah.
And so they have the transaction, which is the passing of a sandal.
Yeah, and that goes right to the heart of covenant. Covenant means a passing between, and they always put something between them. Even today, if you buy a car or something like that, you shake hands with the dealer probably, and that's a placing between the two people who've made a covenant, and the passing of the sandal was symbolic of that covenant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really descriptive and fascinating to see, but Boaz had told her, I will do for you all you ask, and he makes sure that he'll take care of it. Yeah.
You know, I can't help but fast forward to the great descendant of the people of this story, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who himself hung between God and the human race as the in-between, the middleman, as it were, in fulfilling the covenant. And he said, this is the new covenant in my blood. So in a way, Jesus became our kinsman redeemer.
Right.
In a very, very real and spiritual sense. Thanks so much for joining us as we explore this fascinating story of the lovely characters in the book of Ruth. Hope you'll be back with us next week. We'll look forward to seeing you then.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.